At the very bottom of a slave ship's hold, there's a smell that doesn't belong to any living thing. It's rust and vomit. It's sweat that has turned sour. It's human waste, spilled seawater, blood from wrists that were rubbed raw by iron, and the sweet, choking reek of fear, so thick it feels like you could scoop it into your hands. A boy is down there, about 13, maybe younger. His age already stolen, so nobody can be sure. He can't sit upright. He can't stretch his legs. He can't even turn without pressing his face against someone else's shoulder, someone else's ribs. In the darkness, he hears a language he doesn't know, a prayer he can't see, a cough that keeps going until it doesn't. Above him, boots stomp the deck, chains rattle. A hatch slams shut like the lid of a coffin, and then gunfire, shouts, a crash. The ship tilts. The air changes. The boy thinks it's the end, but it isn't. Years later, that same boy will stand in a cathedral an ocean away, dressed in robes of authority, and the world that once chained him will call him Bishop. That contrast, filth to altar, iron to blessing, is not just the hook of his life. It's the fight inside it. Because even when he escaped the ship, another kind of chain followed him. The chain of being told, quietly and politely, that an African could never truly lead. His name was Samuel Ajayi Crowther. Ajayi before he was Samuel, Yoruba before he was acceptable, a survivor before he was a bishop. And Nigeria remembers him not because his story is tidy, but because it is brutally human, terrifyingly improbable, and still unfinished, in the hearts of people who speak the language he helped rescue from silence. He began in a place that, to him, wasn't a village or a region or a dot on a European map. It was simply home. He was born around 1809 in the Yoruba-speaking world, what we now call southwestern Nigeria, into a life that had rhythm, farming seasons, market days, family stories, the everyday sacredness of names and belonging. Ajayi was not a label. It was a root. It meant he was someone's child, someone's future. He belonged to a people with proverbs sharp as knives and songs soft enough to carry grief. And then, one day, the world cracked. The violence that seized him was not random. It was the engine of an economy, the smoke of wars, raids, and political upheaval that fed a monstrous trade. Entire communities could vanish in a night, because somewhere across the water, somebody wanted bodies as fuel. Ajayi was taken during a slave raid, torn from family, from language, from certainty. Imagine the moment. Not a cinematic slow-motion tragedy, but chaos, screaming, feet pounding dirt. Smoke. The sudden knowledge that adults, strong adults, can be helpless, that mothers can be dragged away, that prayers can bounce off the sky and fall back unanswered. He was marched with others, bound, exhausted, hungry, through a landscape that must have looked like home, except it had become hostile. When you are captured, even familiar trees feel like they are watching you die. They reached the coast, and the coast, for the captives, was not a horizon of possibility. It was the mouth of a beast. The slave ship was a factory of dehumanization. People were packed tight, stripped of dignity, renamed by force, if they were named at all. It's hard to describe the cruelty without making it abstract, so picture something concrete. Iron collars, skin swelling under metal, ankles chained so tightly the bone aches. The floor slick with filth because nobody is allowed to rise. The heat pressing down like a hand over the mouth. The sound of weeping turning into silence, because bodies learn to save energy. Ajayi was one of the cargo. But that day, the sea carried a different kind of ship. The British West Africa Squadron, part of Britain's campaign to suppress the transatlantic slave trade, intercepted slavers. Not out of pure saintliness, history is never that clean, but out of a complicated mix of politics, economics, pressure, moral shifts, and empire. Still, whatever the motives, cannons aimed at the slaver meant one thing for the people in the hold: a chance to remain human. When the slave ship was captured, the captives were removed, freed in the narrow sense, released from ownership, yet thrust into an uncertain life. Ajayi was taken to Sierra Leone, to Freetown, a place that had become a strange crossroads of grief and second beginnings. Freed Africans, recaptives, people from many nations and languages, all trying to stitch together identities that had been ripped apart. If you want the first twist of his life, here it is. Freedom did not return him to home. It relocated him into a new world where he would have to rebuild himself from fragments. Many freed captives never found their families again. Many never even learned what happened to them. That kind of loss doesn't end. It echoes. And in Sierra Leone, another transformation began, one that would later make some people praise him as a hero and others accuse him of betrayal. He entered mission schools run by the Church Missionary Society. He learned to read and write. He learned English. He studied Christian teachings. And at some point, after trauma, after disorientation, after the shock of survival, he was baptized. They named him Samuel. Think about what that means. To be baptized is, for many, to be reborn. But for someone like Ajayi, it could also feel like being overwritten. A new name can be a gift, or it can be a quiet theft. And for the rest of his life, he would live inside that tension. Ajayi and Samuel in the same body, the Yoruba soul and the Anglican. Collar, the man who wanted to honor his people and the institution that often struggled to honor him. He was brilliant. That's not romanticizing. It's simply visible in what followed. He became a teacher. He developed a gift for languages, a mind that could hold grammar like architecture. He could listen, compare, translate. Not only words, but worlds. And that's where the second twist slips in, almost unnoticed. The very tool used to control him, language, became the tool he would use to liberate others. Slave traders didn't need you to be eloquent. They needed you to be silent. They needed you reduced to muscle, to labor, to a number in a ledger. But in Sierra Leone, Samuel Ajayi Crowther learned to wield words, and words, in the right hands, are dangerous to oppressors. He started to stand out. Missionaries noticed his intelligence, his discipline, his seriousness. He was not just a convert, he was a mind, a leader in the making. But leadership is not granted by talent alone. It is negotiated through power. And power, especially in the 19th century colonial missionary world, came with skin. Even as a young man, Crowther would have felt it. The ceiling that didn't need to be announced because it was silently understood. He could be useful. He could be admirable. He could even be celebrated as a success story. But could he be equal? That question, like a shadow, followed him. And it's here, early, subtle, almost off-stage, that our key conflict begins to form. Not yet a single enemy with a villain's speech, but a type of enemy, the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper is the person who smiles while limiting you, the person who praises your progress while keeping you in the lower room, the person who loves your work, as long as it serves their vision, not yours. In the missionary world Crowther entered, there were those who sincerely believed Africans could and should lead the African church. And there were those who believed Africans could be taught, used, guided, but never trusted with authority. Crowther's life would become a collision between those two beliefs. For now, in youth, he kept moving. He studied. He served. He taught. He listened. He learned how institutions think. He learned how power speaks politely. And he carried something else too. Memory. Even if he could not return to his birthplace, he did not forget who he was. Yoruba was not a native tongue to him. It was the sound of mothers calling children, the language of jokes and prayers, the hidden music of belonging. And he noticed in Sierra Leone how quickly uprooted people could be made to feel ashamed of their origins, how civilization could mean becoming like us. Crowther would not accept that bargain. He would become Christian, yes, but he would not agree that being Christian required being less African. That decision, quiet at first, almost private, was explosive, because it set him on a path that threatened two industries at once, the industry of selling bodies, and the industry of controlling souls. Imagine him in those early years, still young, still carrying trauma. There is a cruelty in expecting survivors to be instantly grateful, instantly loyal, instantly new. But Crowther did not seem interested in being someone's trophy. He was interested in building a future where his people would not need rescuing by foreigners to be heard by God. Still, the world around him kept pushing a simpler story. Saved from slavery, educated by missionaries, proof that the mission works. It's a flattering story. For the mission, it is not the whole truth. For Crowther, because salvation, if it is real, should not erase your name. And Crowther's mind kept returning to a single stubborn idea. If God speaks to people, why must God always speak in English? That thought may sound innocent, but in the 19th century it was loaded. Language was status. Language was access. Language was control. To translate a faith into a local tongue is to hand people a key, and Crowther was already reaching for keys. By the time he was stepping into adulthood, his path was no longer just about personal survival. It was about returning, one day, not as a captive, but as a messenger. Not as someone dragged inland to coast, but as someone choosing to travel coast to inland with purpose. And he would return to the lands of his people with something that both inspired and threatened. An education that Europeans respected, and a heart that Europeans could not fully predict. Because there is something terrifying to a gatekeeper about a person who can move between worlds. Crowther could pray in the hymns of the missionaries and still hear Yoruba proverbs echoing behind the words. He could write in English and still dream in Yoruba. He could sit in classrooms built by Europeans and still remember the dirt paths of home. He was becoming bilingual in more than language. He was becoming bilingual in identity. And that is exactly the kind of person the world tries to break, because you can't easily put them in a box. As the years in Sierra Leone continued, Crowther's reputation grew. He wasn't simply learning, he was preparing. And somewhere in the machinery of missionary planning, a future began to take shape around him. A return to West Africa, a mission to the Niger region, the long road from student to clergy. But before the robe and the title, before the sermons and the translations, before the fame and the betrayal that would come later, he was still that boy who had survived the hold of a ship. And if you listen closely, you can hear the real beginning of his story not in a church, but in a refusal to let the worst thing that happened to him be the only thing that defined him, a refusal to let Samuel cancel Ajayi, a refusal to accept that Christianity in Africa must always wear a European face. That refusal is the spark, and sparks, when the world is dry enough, become fires. In Sierra Leone, survival stopped being a single dramatic moment and became a daily discipline. Crowther, still carrying Ajayi inside him like a heartbeat, woke up each morning to a new kind of battlefield. Classrooms, hymns, strange alphabets. The polite pressure to become someone else. On paper, it looked like rescue. In his bones, it felt like being reassembled with unfamiliar parts. And yet, something kept pulling him forward. Not because he forgot what was done to him, but because he discovered a terrifying fact. A mind can be stolen from the outside, but it can also be rebuilt from the inside, piece by piece, until it becomes a weapon. He learned letters the way a hungry person learns the location of food. He listened to English not as a music to admire, but as a code to break. He watched the missionaries not with childish awe, but with a survivor's attention, who holds power, how they justify it, what they fear. He also discovered that Christianity, at its best, carried a strange promise, that the worth of a soul is not owned by a market. But Christianity, in human hands, also carried a threat, that you could be told you were equal before God, while being treated as permanently junior before men. That contradiction became his private fire. When Crowther was baptized and began to train seriously within the Church Missionary Society world, he didn't simply accept a new faith, like putting on a coat. He argued with it, wrestled it, tested it against the memory of chains and the smell of the ship's darkness. He was not the kind of convert who collapses into gratitude. He was the kind of convert who asks dangerous questions. If God is just, why did so many good people vanish without a trace? If Christ came for the oppressed, why do the oppressors still hold the microphone? If the gospel is for all nations, why does it come packaged like European property? Some missionaries loved that intensity. Others found it unsettling. A brilliant African Christian was inspiring, until he stopped being a student and started sounding like a leader. And then came an opportunity that looked like destiny and tasted like poison. In 1841, Crowther was selected to be part of the famous Niger expedition, an ambitious journey up the Niger River, driven by a blend of motives: to open trade, to fight the slave trade's grip, to spread Christianity, to reshape the region according to British visions of legitimate commerce and civilization. It was a mission wrapped in idealism and surrounded by death, because the river had its own law: disease. The expedition's ships, iron steamers pushing inland like noisy intruders, carried men who believed they could plan history. But West Africa did not care about their plans. Fever did not negotiate. Malaria did not respect rank. Crowther watched Europeans, men who carried themselves like they owned the future, collapse into shaking, sweating, delirious bodies. Some raved, some begged. Some died so quickly it felt like the jungle had swallowed them without chewing. And here's the ugly, fascinating twist. In that floating crisis, Crowther's Africanness became an advantage. He could endure conditions that crushed others. He could communicate in ways they couldn't. He could interpret the human terrain, not just the geography. And suddenly, the expedition needed him, not as a symbol, not as a student, but as a lifeline. That experience did something to him. It didn't just harden him, it clarified him. He wasn't meant to be a decorative proof that missions worked. He was meant to be a bridge, and bridges are walked on, sometimes by grateful feet, sometimes by boots. After the expedition, Crowther was brought to England. Imagine the shock of it. The damp cold, the gray skies, the stone buildings, the way people looked at him like he was both fascinating and out of place. In London, in training institutions like the CMS College at Islington, he was shaped for ordination, taught theology, discipline, the mechanics of church leadership. He learned how sermons are built, how doctrine is defended, how authority is performed. But he also learned something else: how easily the church could confuse God's kingdom with Britain's kingdom. And this is where the rivalry begins to sharpen into a face. There were missionaries who admired Crowther and wanted to see Africans take real leadership in Africa. But there were also men, polished, persuasive, confident in their own superiority, who could not tolerate the idea of an African bishop, an African commander of the spiritual ship. One of the most influential of these figures was Henry Townsend, a major CMS missionary linked to the early Yoruba mission. Townsend wasn't a cartoon villain. He didn't need to cackle. People like him rarely do. He could write courteous letters and still carry a blade in every paragraph. Crowther, returning from the Niger expedition with growing prestige, was becoming visible as a potential high-ranking African church leader. To Townsend, that possibility was intolerable. Because if Crowther rose, it would mean something simple and devastating. White control would no longer be natural. Townsend's resistance, framed in the language of prudence, order, concern, and standards, was, at its core, racial gatekeeping, the kind that smiles while it blocks the door. Crowther may not have had a full map of Townsend's hostility at first, but he would have felt the atmosphere, the slight hesitations, and the sudden doubts voiced by people who had once praised him, the way his mistakes were magnified and his achievements treated like exceptions. Still, he pushed forward. Crowther was ordained, trained, and set apart for ministry by the Bishop of London. In human terms, this should have been a triumph. A man stolen into slavery, now publicly recognized as a minister of the gospel by one of the highest structures of Anglican authority. But even in that moment, you can feel the tension. Because for a European clergyman, ordination was a ladder step. For an African clergyman, ordination was a test. How will you behave now that you have a collar? Will you stay grateful? Will you stay safe? Will you speak as we prefer? Crowther did not become safe. He returned to West Africa with something that could ignite a continent. Official authority combined with indigenous insight. Back in the Yoruba country, he stepped onto soil that wasn't exactly the same as the home of his childhood. Because war and the slave trade had changed everything. But it was still the land of his language, his ancestral memory. And then came a moment that would have broken many people. He found family, not in a neat reunion scene, but in the raw reality of history. Survivors crossing paths in a world that had tried to erase them. He reconnected with his mother and sister, living proof that his origin story hadn't been completely burned away. If you want a visual for that moment, don't picture tears and a swelling orchestra. Picture something harsher and more honest. A mother looking at a grown man and searching for the child she lost. A son trying to speak without his voice cracking. A silence filled with all the years that were stolen. And in that reunion, Crowther's mission stopped being theoretical. It became personal, almost feral, because now he wasn't preaching to strangers alone. He was preaching into the wound of his own history. He was assigned to mission work in places like Abeokuta, a powerful Yoruba town that had become a refuge and a political center. Crowther and other missionaries, including Townsend, worked to establish a Christian presence there. The environment was not a calm field of harvest, like mission brochures like to imagine. It was tense, strategic, sometimes dangerous. Abeokuta was not waiting politely for outsiders to bring light. Abeokuta had its own leaders, its own spiritual systems, its own pride, and in the background, the Atlantic economy still pulsed. Slavers, traders, rival factions, shifting alliances, fear of encroaching European influence. Crowther's genius was that he didn't treat Yoruba people as blank slates. He understood them from within. He knew the proverbs, the honor codes, the rhythms of speech that decide whether someone trusts you or laughs you out of the room. And he realized something that would define the rest of his life. If you preach a faith in a language people cannot feel, you are not converting them. You're colonizing them. So he began the work that made him unforgettable. He translated. Not casually, not as a side project, but with the intensity of someone pulling a drowning person to shore. He worked on Yoruba grammar and vocabulary, shaping written Yoruba in ways that could carry complex ideas without turning Yoruba into a cheap copy of English. He translated Christian texts into Yoruba, making the Book of Common Prayer and Scripture accessible in the tongue of everyday life. This was not just religious work. It was cultural preservation. It was intellectual resistance. Because when a language is dismissed as primitive, its people are easier to dismiss as well. But when a language gains books, grammar, dictionaries, printed prayers, suddenly it becomes undeniable. It becomes a place you can build institutions on. A language with literature is harder to erase. Crowther wasn't merely preaching the gospel. He was building a bridge for Yoruba identity to survive modernity without dissolving, and that terrified the gatekeepers. Because a Christian Yoruba-speaking church led by Africans would not need constant European supervision. It would not need Europeans to interpret God. It would not need permission to expand. Crowther's very competence was a threat. Townsend's rivalry, meanwhile, was not fought with fists. It was fought with reports, letters, politics, paper bullets. It was fought in the corridors of missionary societies where reputations were currency. Crowther would do something extraordinary, and a gatekeeper would ask, "Yes, but is he reliable?" Crowther would show discipline, and a gatekeeper would whisper, "Yes, but can Africans manage themselves?" Crowther would innovate, and a gatekeeper would mutter, "Yes, but do we risk disorder?" And the cruelest part? Crowther couldn't simply win by being perfect, because the standards were never neutral. A European missionary could fail and be seen as a brave struggler. An African missionary could fail and be seen as proof of a racial theory. Still, Crowther kept moving upstream, literally and spiritually, because his eyes were on the Niger. He had seen the river on the 1841 expedition. He had felt the potential. Communities along the banks, languages like constellations, trade routes that could be reshaped away from, human trafficking towards something else. He believed, almost obsessively, in a chain of mission stations inland, staffed and led by Africans, supported by Africans, speaking African languages. You can hear the ambition in that vision. It's not small. It's not, be thankful you got ordained. It's continent-scale thinking. And in a world that was busy shrinking Africans, Crowther insisted on widening the horizon. But here's the twist that keeps the tension climbing. The same institutions that trained him were now becoming the battlefield that could destroy him. Because Crowther's ascent put pressure on the missionary establishment to answer a simple question it wanted to avoid. Do we truly believe Africans can lead the church in Africa? If the answer was yes, Crowther would rise. If the answer was secretly no, then Crowther would be sabotaged, not openly, not with obvious cruelty, but with concerns, reviews, restructuring, and temporary measures that somehow became permanent. Crowther began to sense that his future would not be decided only by God or by the people he served, but by men in offices thousands of miles away who would never sweat under the Niger sun. And this is where the spiritual drama deepens, because Crowther's coming to God was not a single conversion moment. It was a series of choices under pressure, to serve a church that didn't always trust him, to love a mission that sometimes used him, to preach liberation while walking through polite forms of oppression, to carry hope without becoming naive. He had reasons to become bitter. He had reasons to walk away. He had reasons to turn his intelligence into revenge. Instead, he did something harder. He stayed and tried to transform the system from within using the only tools he trusted: language, discipline, faith, and relentless work. The river was calling, and he intended to answer. And while Crowther prayed, translated, preached, and built, Townsend and other gatekeepers watched him like a storm on the horizon, calculating how to contain him before he became unstoppable. Because once an African stands at the altar as an equal, the old world begins to crack. And the people who benefit from the old world, they don't let it crack quietly. The Niger River does not announce itself politely. It arrives like a moving road, brown, wide, alive, dragging tree trunks, carrying insects that bite like hot needles, reflecting a sun that feels less like warmth and more like judgment. Along its banks, villages appear and disappear behind curtains of green. Canoes cut across the current like blades. And somewhere in that humidity, in that humming air that never truly cools, the old world of the slave trade still breathed. Quietly, stubbornly, through deals, bribes, raids, and fear. Crowther kept returning to this river in his mind because he understood something most of his European colleagues only pretended to: a grasp. If you want to change West Africa, you don't start with speeches in London. You start with the waterways, where people move, trade, marry, argue, and survive. You start where language actually lives. So when he was finally positioned to serve along the Niger, he didn't treat it like a posting. He treated it like a reckoning. Picture the logistics of his ministry, not as a romantic stroll with a Bible, but as a relentless campaign. Travel meant cramped boats, unpredictable currents, storms that could flip your world in seconds. It meant sleeping in heat so thick it pressed sweat out of you even when you were still. It meant carrying supplies, paper, ink, cloth, medicine, because a mission station could die from a missing nail as easily as from a missing sermon. It meant negotiating with local leaders who had every reason to distrust outsiders and every reason to test a man's character before they listened to his God. And then, the services themselves. What worship looked like when it wasn't staged for European reports. A congregation gathered under a simple roof or in open air. Faces glowed with palm oil and sweat. Children shifted and stared. A few skeptical men stood at the edge, arms folded, waiting for the moment the preacher would embarrass himself. Someone began a hymn, not in a polished choir sound, but as a living call, and the voices answered, rough and beautiful, the sound of people trying on faith the way you try on a new garment, cautiously checking the fit. Crowther stepped into that space with a kind of authority that didn't need shouting. He knew the rhythm of Yoruba speech, how to land a point like a drum beat. He knew how to slide a proverb into a sentence, so it felt less like foreign doctrine and more like remembered truth. He knew that conversion is not merely convincing the mind, it's persuading the heart that it can change without being destroyed. And that's where his translation work became something close to warfare. Translation isn't just swapping words. It's deciding what a people are allowed to understand. When Crowther translated scripture and prayers into Yoruba, he was performing a quiet revolution. He was doing the one thing every controlling system hates, handing ordinary people direct access to meaning. A European missionary could be the gatekeeper if the only path to God ran through English. But once the gospel spoke Yoruba, once prayer sounded like home, the gatekeeper's grip weakened. Crowther also trained local clergy, and that was even more dangerous, because it wasn't just texts that made a church independent. It was leadership. It was Africans baptizing, Africans preaching, Africans organizing congregations, Africans correcting errors and shaping practice, from within their own cultural logic. In the missionary imagination that truly respected Africans, this was the goal. In the missionary imagination that secretly needed Africans to remain junior, this was a nightmare. So the rivalry that had been simmering in letters and committees sharpened in the field. Townsend and other gatekeepers didn't attack Crowther by saying, "We don't want an African leader." They attacked him by saying things that sounded responsible. They said he was too soft on local customs. They said he was too trusting of African agents. They said his stations were undisciplined. They said the work needed more European supervision. You can hear the trick, can't you? If Crowther tried to be culturally sensitive, they called him weak. If he tried to be strict, they called him unnatural. If he succeeded, they called him an exception. If anyone under him failed, they called it proof. And yet his work kept expanding. He moved through communities that had seen enough foreign traders to know the smell of exploitation. He preached against slavery with a survivor's credibility. He could speak about chains without sounding theoretical. When he talked about freedom, it wasn't a moral idea. It was a memory in his skin. Sometimes the drama was direct. A chief measuring him with narrowed eyes, asking what he really wanted. Sometimes it was subtle. Local elites weighing whether Christianity was a political advantage or a cultural threat. Crowther navigated those tensions with a kind of strategic patience, never forgetting that faith in West Africa could not be planted like a flag. It had to be woven, slowly, into real life. And his greatest weapon remained language. He didn't just preach. He built structures, grammars, vocabularies, printed texts. He treated Yoruba as a language worthy of scholarship, not a dialect to be tolerated. That alone changed the future. A written language can travel farther than any missionary boat. It can outlive the missionary himself. But Crowther wasn't only Yoruba-focused. The Niger region is a mosaic of peoples, and he understood that the church could not be a single-lane road. He pushed toward multilingual work, toward the idea that God didn't need one African language either. The goal wasn't to replace English control with Yoruba control. The goal was something more radical. A church that could belong to many. Then came the moment that should have silenced every doubter forever. In 1864, Samuel Ajayi Crowther was consecrated as a bishop, an Anglican bishop, making him the first African to reach that office in the Anglican tradition. Let that land like it deserves to land. A boy stolen into slavery, packed into darkness, rescued but uprooted, remade by education. Now standing in the line of bishops, an office that had been reserved in practice for Europeans, it should have been a victory parade. Instead, it became a target on his back. Because once Crowther wore the mitre, once he carried that title, he wasn't just a talented African worker. He was a living contradiction of white supremacy. His very existence demanded a choice: accept African authority or sabotage it. Crowther became bishop of the Niger territory, responsible for a vast, complex region. Imagine the pressure. Enormous distances, fragile mission stations, constant health risks, political instability, the shadow of the slave trade, and the growing presence of European commercial interests that wanted the Niger for profits. His episcopate was not a desk job. It was motion and crisis. He confirmed believers, ordained clergy, negotiated disputes, tried to enforce standards, tried to prevent moral scandal, tried to maintain supplies, tried to keep missionaries alive, tried to prevent the church from becoming a tool of exploitation. And he did all that while being watched, not just watched by the communities he served, who had every right to evaluate him, but watched by European officials and rival missionaries, who were waiting for the smallest crack to widen into a collapse. If you want a visual metaphor for his life at this stage, picture him walking a rope bridge over a river. Under him is the current: history, racism, empire, disease, human weakness. In his hands he carries fragile objects, newly translated texts, newly trained clergy, newly formed congregations, the fragile trust of communities that could turn away if betrayed. And from both sides, people throw stones, not always to kill him, sometimes just to make him wobble. One of the most underappreciated facts about leadership is this: you are judged not only by what you do, but by what others do in your name. Crowther appointed and relied upon African clergy and agents because the mission could not function otherwise. Europeans were too few, too often sick, too often detached from local realities. But every time an African agent made a mistake, mismanaged funds, mishandled discipline, offended a community, failed to keep strict European-style records, Crowther's enemies smiled, because it wasn't about the mistake. It was about the story the mistake served. The story they wanted was simple: Africans cannot govern themselves. Crowther was fighting that story with his whole body. He traveled up and down the river. He visited stations that were barely more than a building and a handful of believers. He sat with local leaders, persuading them that Christianity was not a trick to steal land, not a mask for foreign conquest, because, increasingly, those suspicions were not paranoia, they were prophecy. The British imperial presence was expanding. Trade companies were hungry. Politics was tightening like a fist. And here's the bitter twist: Crowther's mission, which aimed to bring spiritual liberation, was operating in the same geographic space as imperial ambition. Even if he didn't want to be associated with conquest, the world around him kept trying to fuse the two. So his preaching had to do double work. He preached Christ, but also had to convince people he wasn't the advance scout of a foreign takeover. He preached morality, but also had to resist becoming a moral police force that served colonial order. He preached love, but also had to confront the brutal economics that treated Africans as labor or obstacles. Meanwhile, the rivalry at the institutional level was maturing into a coordinated campaign. Letters traveled faster than truth. Reports written in comfortable rooms could condemn work done in swamps. And the most poisonous weapon in bureaucratic warfare is not accusation, it's concern. Crowther's opponents questioned his administrative capacity. They questioned the quality of his African clergy. They implied his leadership was too native, too informal, too compromised. And perhaps the ugliest move of all, they began to portray his cultural empathy as spiritual weakness. If Crowther tolerated certain customs, while patiently teaching gradual change, they called it compromise. If he challenged customs too sharply, they said he was stirring unrest. The trap was perfect. There was no safe posture. Crowther responded the way he always had: work harder, translate more, train more, travel more, pray more. He tried to prove them wrong with performance. But that's the thing about racial gatekeeping. It isn't a debate you can win with facts, because the conclusion was decided before the evidence arrived. Still, he achieved something enormous in these years. He helped anchor Christianity in the Niger region with African leadership at its core. He laid foundations for local churches that didn't feel like foreign outposts. He expanded education and literacy. He demonstrated, publicly, undeniably, that Africans could hold episcopal authority with dignity and intellectual strength. And in the middle of all that, he kept returning to the most intimate radical act, putting sacred words into African mouths in African languages. Imagine a service where someone hears scripture in Yoruba for the first time, not as a clumsy translation whispered after an English reading, but as the main voice of the text. Imagine an elderly woman who has watched traders come and go, who has been told by life that power always speaks a foreign tongue, suddenly hearing God addressed to her in the language she thinks in. That is not mission success. That is a reordering of reality. Crowther knew it. His enemies knew it too. And so the campaign against him escalated. More European missionaries were introduced into the Niger mission, not simply as colleagues, but as supervisors in disguise. They arrived with assumptions sharpened into arrogance. They didn't come to learn from Crowther. They came to measure him against standards designed without him. They kept records like prosecutors. They interpreted every difficulty as incompetence. They looked at the chaos of frontier mission work, disease, conflict, logistical collapse, and blamed it on the one African who sat at the top. Crowther began to face a quiet but brutal phenomenon, being outnumbered inside his own mission. The very mission he had built with African hands was being repopulated with Europeans who treated African agents like servants and Crowther like a figurehead. And the stress wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Because a bishop is supposed to be a shepherd. But how do you shepherd when wolves wear the same uniform as the sheep? How do you discipline a European missionary who disrespects Africans when the institution will defend him as one of ours? How do you protect your clergy when a single report to London can ruin reputations and careers? Crowther had survived chains and shipholds. But this polite administrative suffocation was a different kind of cruelty. It didn't bruise the skin. It bruised the soul. He wrote. He argued. He defended his clergy. He appealed to fairness. Sometimes he won small battles. Often he lost ground in ways that weren't obvious until months later. And yet, he kept preaching. Because preaching was the one space where the truth could still be spoken without being edited by a committee. There's a certain kind of sermon that comes from a man who has been betrayed by institutions, but refuses to abandon God. It doesn't sound naive. It sounds like iron wrapped in compassion. Crowther preached about dignity, not as a slogan, but as a reality rooted in creation. He preached about liberation, not as politics, but as the moral scandal of treating humans like property. He preached about humility, not as submission to racism, but as spiritual strength that refuses to become cruel in response to cruelty. He preached about the cross. And for him, the cross was not a decorative symbol. It was the picture of what happens when power cannot tolerate a righteous disruption. And as he preached, the pressure tightened. The whispers grew louder. The concerns became formal inquiries. The Europeans around him started acting less like partners and more like auditors. Crowther must have realized with a cold clarity that the fight was no longer simply about methods or budgets. It was about whether the Anglican mission in West Africa would allow Africans to truly lead, or whether his episcopate would be treated as a temporary experiment to be declared a failure. And here's the cruelest twist of all. The people who claimed to be fighting the slave trade were now trying to enslave the African, a church. By making it dependent, supervised, and permanently junior, Crowther stood at the center of that contradiction like a man holding back a flood with his hands. He had become exactly what Nigeria would later honor, a symbol of African intellect, resilience, and spiritual authority. But in his own lifetime, that symbolism came with a cost. He was being set up, not necessarily for execution, but for humiliation. Because to destroy a leader like Crowther, you don't need to kill him. You just need to convince the world that his leadership was a mistake. And the machinery to do that was already in motion. Letters traveling, reputations being rewritten, narrative being engineered. The river kept flowing. The stations kept breathing. The hymns kept rising into humid air. But somewhere behind the music, you could hear another sound approaching. the sound of the institution turning its face away from its first African bishop. By the time Samuel Ajayi Crowther grew old, the most dangerous thing about his story wasn't the slave ship anymore. It was the slow, smiling violence of respectable betrayal. Because chains are obvious. You can point at iron and say, "This is evil." But when the knife comes wrapped in church language, when a man is undermined with hymns in the background, it becomes harder to name. It becomes easier for the world to pretend nothing is happening. Crowther could feel the mission tightening around him like a noose made of paperwork. European missionaries, newer men, often younger, often bolder in their confidence, arrived on the Niger with an attitude that wasn't curiosity, but judgment. They acted as if the mission had begun when they arrived, as if Crowther's decades of labor were merely a prologue to real work. They measured African clergy like defective tools. They assumed corruption before they asked questions. And when they spoke of standards, they meant European control. Crowther's enemies didn't need to shout that he was unfit. They just needed to flood London with a steady drip of insinuation. A station struggled? Crowther's fault. An African agent made an error? Crowther's proof. A local community resisted? Crowther's incompetence. Records were messy in a frontier swamp? Crowther's inability to govern. And the tragedy is this. Frontier missions are messy even under brilliant leadership. Disease breaks plans. Rivers change routes. Politics shifts. Human beings disappoint. But Crowther's leadership was being judged not by the reality of the Niger, but by the expectations of people who wanted a tidy narrative. And tidy narratives are the enemy of truth. So the campaign against him matured into something institutional, an effort to reform the Niger mission by replacing African agency with European supervision. The language was smooth. The intent was brutal. They talked about correcting abuses. They talked about restoring discipline. They talked about protecting the work. But what they were really doing was reasserting a hierarchy, and at the top of the hierarchy, they did not want an African. Crowther fought back the only way he knew how, with letters, appeals, careful arguments, and relentless service. He defended his clergy. He tried to explain context. He tried to show that failures were not racial inevitabilities, but human challenges. He tried to remind the Church Missionary Society of its own stated ideals. But the older he became, the clearer it got. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a verdict being prepared. The worst part wasn't even that Europeans criticized him. Criticism can be useful. The worst part was that he began to watch the mission quietly strip power away from African hands, the very hands that had kept it alive. He watched African clergy treated as suspects rather than brothers. He watched white missionaries talk over him, around him, past him, as if he were a ceremonial object rather than the bishop in charge. He watched the concept of an indigenous African-led church, his life's vision, being slowly replaced by a model of permanent European control. And then, in the final years, came the deepest humiliation, the effective sidelining of Crowther's authority, not always with a dramatic public declaration, but with decisions made above his head, with European visitors and inspectors empowered to overrule him, with London listening more eagerly to the complaints against him than to his own voice. There's a particular cruelty in undermining an elder. You don't just damage his position, you rewrite his legacy while he is still alive to watch it happen. Crowther was not naive. He understood what was going on, and that understanding, layered on top of everything he had already survived, must have been exhausting beyond words. In those years, his body aged under a pressure that had never stopped. He was still the man who had traveled rivers and endured fevers, but now his battlefield was mostly invisible. Reputation, trust, institutional memory. And yet, even as they tried to shrink him, the truth of his work remained stubbornly visible across West Africa. His translations didn't disappear when bureaucrats frowned. His grammars didn't dissolve because a report criticized his management. The Yoruba words he had helped print could not be unprinted. The churches he had helped build could not be unbuilt without admitting the whole mission had depended on African leadership all along. In other words, Even if they diminished the bishop, they could not erase the bridge he had become. Still, bridges pay a price. As Crowther entered his final stretch of life, he was carrying not only his personal sorrow, but also the disappointment of a dream partially betrayed. He had wanted an African-led church on the Niger. He had believed, perhaps too hopefully, that the institution that consecrated him would protect him. But institutions rarely protect what threatens their comfortable order. And here's the twist that makes his ending burn. Crowther's enemies did not fully win by defeating him. They won by teaching a generation of Africans a brutal lesson about the nature of power. Because when African Christians watch their own bishop, consecrated, educated, loyal, still be doubted and undermined, something inside them hardened into clarity. If Crowther could be treated like that, then no African would ever be truly safe inside a system that did not fundamentally respect African equality. That realization did not kill Christianity in Nigeria. It changed Christianity in Nigeria. It seeded the desire for independence, for self-governance, for churches that would not beg Europe for permission to exist. It pushed people toward indigenous movements, African-led denominations, and later, political consciousness as well. The faith remained, but the illusion of European benevolence cracked. Crowther's pain became fuel. In 1891, Samuel Ajayi Crowther died. Try to picture his final days without romantic fog. An old man whose life began in chains, who survived oceans, who learned languages like weapons, who became a bishop, who built missions, who translated scripture, who trained clergy, now facing the quiet truth that he had been honored publicly and undermined privately. Death came not as a dramatic climax, but as the last page of a life spent fighting currents. And yet, his death did not end the battle over his name. Because that's what happens to people like Crowther. The struggle continues over the meaning of their life. Some wanted to remember him as a successful convert, a story that flatters European missions. Others wanted to remember him as a flawed administrator, an excuse to justify taking power back. But Nigerians, especially Yoruba Christians, scholars, and many within the broader Nigerian Anglican tradition, kept reaching for a deeper truth. Crowther was a founder, a pioneer, a man who proved African intellectual and spiritual leadership could stand at the highest level. And it wasn't only church people who understood his importance. Language itself became part of his monument. Because one of the most powerful forms of legacy is this: when millions of people read and pray and learn in a written form of their language, and they don't even realize that someone had to fight for that language to be treated as worthy. Crowther helped make Yoruba a language of print, scholarship, and scripture. He helped stabilize spelling and grammar in ways that shaped future literature and education. He gave Yoruba Christianity a voice that sounded like home rather than imitation. And that's one reason he's honored in Nigeria. Because he didn't just bring a message. He protected a people's ability to speak that message in their own skin. But his honor goes deeper than linguistics. Nigerians remember him because his life is a mirror of the nation's own wounds and resilience. Nigeria, like Crowther, has known kidnapping, forced displacement, exploitation by foreign interests, the violence of trade and empire. Nigeria, like Crowther, has also known reinvention, education, faith, political awakening, cultural revival. When Nigerians look at Crowther, they don't only see a bishop. They see a survivor who refused to be reduced. They see a man who carried two names without letting one cancel the other. They see a leader who tried to build something indigenous inside a system that wasn't always ready for equality. They see the cost of being first, the loneliness, the scrutiny, the attacks disguised as concern. They see a warning about institutions and a hope about people. And there's another twist. Quiet, almost poetic. Crowther's enemies attempted to control the African church by controlling its leadership. But Crowther's influence spread through something harder to control than leadership: culture. Once you translate into a local language, you don't just create Christians. You create readers. You create thinkers. You create people who can debate, interpret, and challenge. You create communities that don't need foreign intermediaries to access God. That is why the name Crowther still matters. Because his greatest legacy is not that he was appointed by a European system. It is that he helped make the African church capable of outgrowing European control. And that outgrowing, slow, messy, human, became part of Nigeria's spiritual DNA. Today, his memory lives in churches, schools, histories, and names. It lives every time Yoruba is treated as a language worthy of books. It lives every time Nigerian Christians lead without asking permission from anyone overseas. It lives every time a person who has been humiliated by the world refuses to let humiliation define the end of the story. If you go back to the image from the beginning, the slave ship hold, the stench, the boy who couldn't stand, there's one detail that changes when you know how the story ends. That boy was never only cargo. He was always a future that terrified the people who profited from human silence. He survived the worst thing humans can do to each other, and then built something that could not be chained, a voice. And maybe that's the reason he is honored in Nigeria above all. Not because his life was perfect, not because his enemies never bruised him, but because he proved that even when the world tries to erase you, you can still become the kind of person whose name is spoken with respect by the very people the world wanted to keep voiceless.